Welcome to Shrewsbury, the county town of Shropshire. Guarded on three sides by the River Severn, Shrewsbury sits on top of a rocky sandstone hill. Now, tradition holds that this was the site of Pengwern, the seat of the Welsh princes of Powys. The Saxons knew it as Shrewsbury, the fortified town on the scrub-covered hill. And recognising its military significance, the Normans built a castle here and called it Salop. As the town grew and prospered from the Welsh woolen trade, the castle suffered a decline in importance. Its final defensive role came during the Civil War, when the Roundheads took it, following a brief skirmish. By the 18th century, Shrewsbury was an important stagecoach town, and in Victorian times it was transformed by the coming of the railways. Regarded as England's finest Tudor town, Shrewsbury today is a major tourist attraction. And it's also the perfect base from which to explore the many places of interest in the locality. So, before we go on to explore the town of Shrewsbury, we'll take a look at just a few of these sites. Set in the very heart of the county, Shrewsbury is surrounded by some of the finest countryside in England. To the south and west are the beautiful rolling Shropshire hills, which are steeped in folklore and legend. Podsford Hill has several legends associated with it, one of which was used by Mary Webb in her novel The Golden Arrow. The arrow was supposedly lost during a battle between the Saxon kings of Mercia and Wessex. Tradition holds that whoever finds the arrow will inherit a great fortune. Mary Webb wrote this book whilst living at Roseville Cottage in nearby Pontesbury. At Caer Caradoc near Church Stretton, King Caractacus is said to have fought his final battle against the Romans. After his defeat and capture, Caractacus was taken to Rome to be displayed and humiliated before the city. However, the emperor was so impressed with his dignity and bravery that Caractacus was pardoned and given a pension for life. As well as stunning countryside, Shrewsbury is blessed with an abundance of historic sites and buildings right on its doorstep. A few miles east of the town is the dramatic Iron Bridge Gorge, regarded as the birthplace of industry and now a World Heritage Site. An unlikely place for the birth of an industrial revolution, it was here that Abraham Darby first smelted iron with coke in 1709. And it was here that his grandson built the first iron bridge in 1779. The Mitten and Mermaid Hotel at Atcham is named after John Mad Jack Mitten, a local squire who squandered his family fortune and ended his days in a pauper's prison. Said to have drunk up to 6 bottles of port a day, Jack's daredevilry and practical jokes were legendary. He is said to have released a fox in the hotel and set a pack of hounds after it, followed closely by himself on horseback. Jack's ghost is believed to haunt the Mitten and Mermaid Inn every year on September the 30th, the anniversary of his birthday. Acton Burnell Castle was built in the 13th century by Robert Burnell, tutor and later Chancellor to Edward I. In 1284, Edward gave Robert permission to fortify what was really nothing more than a manor house. It is claimed that these gable walls are the remains of a barn, which hosted the first English Parliament. Edward convened the assembly during one of his many campaigns against the troublesome Welsh. The remains are now sited in the grounds of the Concord International College, a former convent school, where General de Gaulle's daughter was educated during the Second World War. Just a mile or so down the road from Acton Burnell stands the unassuming Langley Chapel. Noted for its 17th century Puritan furnishings, the chapel was actually built in the mid-16th century. The reader's pulpit was unusually positioned, so that the minister could face the congregation at all times, whilst worshippers would kneel around the altar to take communion. Near to the chapel are the impressive Langley Gates, which once formed the entrance to the now dismantled Langley Manor. Pulled down in the late 18th century, the timber-framed hall was owned by the Lee family, descendants of the Burnells. Entry to the house would have been from behind the gates, where the present farmhouse now stands. Condover Hall was built in the mid-16th century and has been dubbed Shropshire's finest Elizabethan house. Commissioned by Thomas Owen, the house was later owned by Clive of India. It counts among its list of famous guests the American writer Mark Twain, who stayed here on more than one occasion. A story connected with Condover Hall tells of a servant wrongly accused of his master's death by the Lord's Son. As he stood on the gallows, the innocent man cursed the son and all descendants that followed him. It is said that the dying man left a bloody handprint on a wall that defied all attempts at washing it away. And it is claimed that, true to the curse, no heir to Condover Hall ever did prosper. The village of Condover was the birthplace of Richard Tarleton, court jester to Queen Elizabeth I. Richard, the son of a local farmer, was short, hump-backed, and very ugly. He was, however, admired and feared for his accomplished swordsmanship and his razor-sharp wit. The Queen always maintained that he did more to cure her bouts of melancholy than any of her physicians. It is likely that Shakespeare had Tarleton in mind when he wrote the part of Yorick in Hamlet. At Wroxeter, we can see the remains of Uriconium, the fourth largest city in Roman Britain. It began life as an important military camp on Watling Street, now the A5. Developing as a civil centre only after the legions had moved north to Chester. In their book, The Search for the Real Arthur, the writers Phillips and Keatman claimed that this is the true site of Camelot, King Arthur's legendary fortress. In and around the Shrewsbury area there are a number of ecclesiastical ruins. At Buildwas, on the banks of the River Severn, are the remains of a 12th century Cistercian abbey. During medieval times it was a major landlord in the area, and during the 16th century it even had its own ironworks. This was taken over by private enterprise after the dissolution, and may have been the forerunner of the later Coalbrookdale industry. Wenlock Priory was founded in the 7th century by St. Milburga, a Saxon princess. At the time of her death, the priory was one of the wealthiest in Mercia, but by the 9th century it was out of use, possibly destroyed by Viking raiders. The Normans rebuilt and restored the priory, which became home to a brotherhood of Cluniac monks from France. The buildings we see today, however, are largely from the 13th century. On the very outskirts of Shrewsbury is Hormond Abbey, yet another 12th century ruin. In 1154, Henry II's former tutor was installed as abbot, and under royal patronage the abbey grew in size and importance. After the dissolution, it was converted to a private residence, when the bay windows and fireplaces were added. The property was finally destroyed by fire during the Civil War. It is not surprising to discover that the ghostly remains of Morton Corbett Castle are said to be haunted. What is unusual is the claim that several local motorists have had their cars invaded by a multicoloured witch as they drive past the site. She supposedly stays with the vehicle for a mile or so, and then leaves just as suddenly as she arrives. Built in 1579 by Sir Andrew Corbett, the house would have been one of the finest in Shropshire. It was besieged and burned down by parliamentarian troops during the Civil War. The original keep dates from the 12th century, as does St. Bartholomew's Church. Around the site are the traces of a medieval village, which was dismantled by the Corbetts in the 16th century to make way for their mansion and park. In between Morton Corbett and Shrewsbury is Battlefield Church, which was founded in 1403 by Henry IV. Henry built the church as a college to pray for the souls of those killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury. After the battle, the body of Harry Hotspur was quartered and displayed in the town, before being sent to the four corners of the kingdom. Hotspur had set up camp in the village of Upper Berwick on the eve of the battle. On hearing the name of the village, he is reputed to have said that his plough was drawing its last furrow, as a wizard had told him he would perish at Berwick. Coming from the north, he had always believed that the prophecy referred to Berwick-on-Tweed. The modern Shire Hall at the top of Abbey Foregate makes a good starting point for a tour of Shrewsbury. Near to it is Lord Hill's Column, which was built between 1814 and 1816 to commemorate one of Wellington's generals at the Battle of Waterloo. The statue stands on top of what is claimed to be the largest freestanding Greek Doric column in the world. At the bottom of Abbey Foregate is the Abbey Church, which is the remnant of the abbey founded by Roger Montgomery in the 11th century. Roger, a kinsman of William the Conqueror, entered the abbey as a lay priest just 3 days before his death. At its height, the abbey was one of the most influential in England. Edward, son of Edward IV, visited Shrewsbury several times as Prince of Wales and stayed at the abbey. And in 1595, Henry VIII resided here, while staying in the town. In 1403, on the eve of the Battle of Shrewsbury, the abbot made a vain, desperate attempt to get Henry IV and Harry Hotspur to call off hostilities. This building, known as the Old Infirmary, was only ever a hospital in the sense that it offered hospitality to travelling pilgrims. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1540, much of the church and the cloisters were dismantled. A lucky survivor was the reader's pulpit. This is where scriptures would be read to monks as they ate their meals in the refectory. It was probably retained as a gazebo in the garden of the new owner. The final desecration of the old abbey came in the 18th century, when Thomas Telford cut through the site to make way for a new road. Near to the abbey is the Dun Cow Inn, which is rumoured to be home to the ghost of a medieval cleric. Some years ago, the landlord's wife awoke from her sleep to see the figure of a monk crouched over her baby daughter's cot. 2 years later, the phantom revisited the child, who awoke screaming and terrified by the shadowy figure. The ghost has been seen many times since, disappearing through walls at night. Built by John Gwynne between 1769 and 1775, the New English Bridge replaced the previous bridge on this site. The old bridge had a stone east gate with a drawbridge, which was used as a prison. It was washed away by a great flood, and one prisoner, who miraculously survived, was released and pardoned. Gwynne's Bridge has since been widened, but retains its original design, including the dolphins on the cutwaters. On the town side of the bridge, the road rises steeply up the oddly named Weil Cop, which probably derives from the Welsh, meaning hilltop. Situated on the Weil Cop is the Nag's Head Inn, which adjoins the remains of an impressive 15th century building, with a rare screens passage. We are looking at what is known as the Spear Truss, which partitioned the passage from the Great Hall. From the passage, these unexpectedly well-preserved service doors would have accessed the service quarters and upstairs. The doorway on the first floor was external and allowed musicians to enter the building without passing through the house. Built in 1430, Henry Tudor House takes its name from Henry, Duke of Richmond, who went on to become Henry VII. Henry is supposed to have lodged here before going on to win the Battle of Bosworth Field. Through the archway is Barracks Passage, which leads to this range of buildings, said to have housed Henry's troops. The Lion Hotel, listed as a building of special architectural and historic interest, was a former coaching inn. Much of the hotel dates from the 18th century, when extensive rebuilding took place. But some of the oldest rooms are of Tudor origin. The Adam Room, formerly known as the Assembly Room, has played host to an impressive list of guests, including Charles Dickens, Benjamin Disraeli, Madame Tussaud, and Paganini. In the 19th century, the landlord of the Lion Hotel operated a coaching service, known as the Shrewsbury Wonder. The Wonder was so reliable that people would set their watches by it, rather than by the church clock. One coach driver was noted for entering the stable yard in spectacular style. Without slowing down, he would swing wide to the far side of the road and turn his coach and horses into the yard. The old house in Dogpole was once owned by Anthony Rock, a servant of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. It is believed that Mary Tudor also stayed here for a time. In the island between St Mary's Street and the High Street are the churches of St Julian and St Alkmund. St Julian's, which was largely rebuilt in the early 18th century, has been used for more secular purposes in recent years. Close to St Julian's is the church of St Alkmund's, which, apart from its tower, was also rebuilt in the 18th century. It has a striking east window of 1795, which is a copy of Rennie's Assumption of the Virgin. Local records tell us that during a violent storm in 1533, the devil appeared and shot up the steeple, where he tore out the wires of the clock and clawed the fourth bell. The claw marks are said to be still visible. This narrow alley, or shut, which runs off High Street, is known as Grope Lane. The polite explanation for the name is that due to the lack of light in the area, it would have been necessary to grope one's way along after dark. But in truth, the darkness of the alley was probably very conducive to the kind of groping which actually took place here. It was, for all intents and purposes, an area of ill repute. The Bear Steps at the top of Grope Lane are named after the Bear Inn, which used to stand here. These in turn lead us to the appropriately named Bear Steps Hall, which now houses the offices of the Shrewsbury Civic Society. The mid-14th century hall is in fact just part of a group of buildings, which also contained an arcaded range of shops. It is possible that they were originally owned by the Guild of the Holy Cross, founded by Thomas Pride in 1389. Completely restored in 1969, the hall has this splendid exposed timbered roof. The aptly named Butcher's Row is where in the past cattle would have been slaughtered and meat openly displayed. The sights and smells of the area, together with the dangers of cattle marauding through the streets, finally persuaded the town's elders to ban the practice from the centre of town. Situated in Butcher's Row is this fine half-timbered building, known as the Abbot's House. Local tradition holds that this was built as a town house for the Abbots of Lilleshall, but the claim has been strongly rejected by some local historians. However, it has been pointed out that the building is situated on the corner of Fish Street, which has an inn called the Three Fishes. Since the Bishop of Lilleshall's badge had 3 fishes, it could be the tradition carries some credence. Whatever the case, it is certainly one of the oldest houses in the town. The lower floor structure is a good example of a medieval shop frontage, with its wide oak sills for displaying goods. The upper stories would have been individual apartments and may have been built to raise income for the abbey. The Church of St Mary's is by far the grandest in Shrewsbury. At the end of the 19th century, it was expected that it would become a cathedral church. Sadly, by the close of the 20th century, it had been made redundant. St Mary's has dominated the heart of Shrewsbury for over 1,000 years. Built on the highest point of the town, it is probable that a church existed on the site as far back as the reign of King Edgar in the 10th century. Rebuilt by the Normans, the church has been altered considerably over the years. The sturdy red sandstone tower carries a spire rising to nearly 140 feet, said to be the third highest in the country. Perhaps St Mary's most striking attribute is its collection of stained glass windows, one of the finest in England. The great east window, known as the Jesse window, traces the family history of Jesus back to the time of David and Jesse. It was moved to St Mary's in 1792 after being removed from the ruin of old St Chad's. Almost as precious as the Jesse window are these panels in the north window of the chancel, which originally came from an abbey near Cologne. They are considered some of the most valuable and best preserved examples of their kind. This bust near the vestry door is dedicated to Admiral Benbow, who was born in Old St Mary's Vicarage in 1653. A colourful character, it is claimed he preserved the heads of 13 Moorish pirates in brine and presented them to the customs house in Cadiz. The remains of an old poplar tree used to mark the house where Benbow was born. In its branches there hung a key, which he supposedly hid before running away to sea. Until it was demolished recently, the key and a section of the tree trunk were displayed outside a local garage. They have now been re-sited in a new housing development on the site. A tablet on the west side of the tower commemorates the steeplejack Robert Cadman, who died whilst attempting to slide down a rope from the top of the tower to the far bank of the Severn. The Parade Shopping Centre, formerly the Royal Salop Infirmary, was built in 1826 to an Edward Haycock design. It replaced a fine Georgian house built by William Baker, where the original infirmary was founded in 1747. As with many Shrewsbury buildings, tales of ghosts abound. A white lady was supposed to wander the wards of the old hospital, and if her figure was seen to linger at the foot of a bed, it was certain that the patient would die during the course of the night. Some traders in the centre still believe the building to be haunted. They report hearing the strange sound of footsteps on the stairs and items which mysteriously move from one place to another. It is said that after York, Shrewsbury is the most haunted town in the country. Certainly it has long been a place of great superstition. In 1584, parishioners of St Mary's were being interrogated about the practice of witchcraft and sorcery by local midwives. One well-known saying of the time was, "Cut your nails on a Friday, cut your sorrow. Cut them on a Sunday, see the devil tomorrow." St Mary's Watergate is the sole surviving gate from the 13th century town walls. It is believed that with inside help, parliamentarian troops entered the town through this gate in 1645. The attack was led by Lieutenant Benbow, no relation to Admiral Benbow, who later converted to the Royalist cause. 6 years later, Benbow was captured by parliamentarian soldiers at the Battle of Worcester, and on Cromwell's direct command, he was returned to Shrewsbury and shot at the very place he entered the town. The Jacobean Council House Gateway, one of Shrewsbury's finest timber-framed buildings, has a date stamp of 1620. It may well have witnessed one of the most memorable incidents in the town's history. In 1642, while staying in the council buildings, Charles I offered to make Shrewsbury into a city, but the burgesses of the town declined the offer, and in so doing, earned for themselves the enduring tag, Proud Salopians. Through the gate is the Council House, which was the occasional home of the Lord President of the Marches. The council, which was based at Ludlow, controlled vast stretches of the border regions, together with most of Wales. Shrewsbury Castle was built by Roger Montgomery shortly after the Norman conquest. It replaced a royal fortress destroyed by Wild Edric, a rebellious Saxon lord. According to the Domesday Book, the Normans demolished 51 properties to make way for the castle, which probably did little to endear them to the local populace. The original Outer Bailey was much larger than it is today, extending well into the town, and consequently offered much greater protection. The castle was connected to the medieval Upper Town Gate by this sloping sandstone wall. The remnants of the gate were demolished in 1786. Following Roger's death, the castle passed to his son, Robert de Balem, who succeeded in losing it to the crown. Robert had been a leading player in the failed rebellion against King Henry I. After Henry's death, civil war broke out between supporters of King Stephen and the Empress Matilda. The castle was besieged by Stephen's troops and finally fell in 1138. It is said that 100 of the castle defenders were hung from the battlements. Rebuilt in the 13th century by Edward I, the castle then went into a long period of decline, and following its opposition to Parliament during the Civil War, it was finally dismantled. In the 18th century, the castle passed into the hands of Sir William Pulteney, who commissioned Thomas Telford to convert it into a private dwelling. It was Telford who built Laura's Tower, a folly named after Sir William's daughter. Today, the castle is home to the Shropshire Regimental Museum. A product of the Reformation, the Old Grammar School was founded in 1552. The medieval timber-frame building known as Riggs Hall has a crown-post roof and is probably part of the earlier school. The grand stone-faced building we see today was constructed around the turn of the 17th century and displays a mixture of both classic and Gothic styles. Above the Corinthian columns of the gateway entrance are two carved figures, Philomethes and Polemethes, said to stand for he who knows much, and he who wants to know much. The school developed into one of the largest and most important of its kind, finally emerging as a major public school in the 19th century. By this time it had outgrown the site, and in 1882 moved to its present location at Kingsland, on the other side of the river. Today the building is home to the town library and is guarded by a statue of its most famous scholar, Charles Darwin. Hidden away at the back of this shop at number 2 Pride Hill are the remains of a 13th century building known as Bennet's Hall. Current thinking suggests that this would have been the home of a wealthy wool merchant, the undercroft below being used for storing wool. But an older tradition believed that this was a private chapel attached to the hall, and was at one time owned by the Abbot of Ormond. Traditionally, this is held to be the site of the Civil War Mint, and is still sometimes referred to as the Mint. One of Shrewsbury's more questionable claims to fame is as the home of Simnel cake. It is said that a woman named Nell was baking a cake using unleavened dough from Lent and leftover Christmas pudding. As Nell was about to put the cake in the oven, her husband Simon said she should boil it instead. Following a ferocious argument, Nell agreed to boil it first and then bake it. She then suggested they use the first 3 letters from both their names and called it Simnel Cake. The curiously shaped King's Head in Mardol owes its pronounced lean to an ill-conceived alteration to the roof structure. Originally, there would have been 2 roofs at right angles to the street, which would have had gable ends. At some point in its history, these were removed and replaced with the roof we see today. Inside the building is this splendid 15th century wall painting, which contains a representation of the Last Supper. Known as Rowley's House, or Rowley's Mansion, this building actually consists of 2 separate houses. The timber-framed part of the house was built in the late 16th century, and is where William Rowley first lived after he moved to Shrewsbury. Both a draper and a brewer, Rowley was obviously a very wealthy man, as he was able to add this brick phase of the house in 1618. This was the first time that a wholly brick-built house had been constructed in Shrewsbury. Today, the building houses the town museum, with a fine collection of local archaeological finds, including these specimens taken from the Roman site at nearby Wroxeter. The present Welsh Bridge was built by Carline and Tilly in 1795 to replace the fine old medieval bridge that had previously stood just a little upstream. Thomas Telford warned that the proposed new site would be susceptible to scouring and could threaten the integrity of the bridge. His prediction proved correct, and in 1833 it was necessary to carry out improvements to the footings. There used to be a pulley above the central arch, which was used to pull trows upstream. These flat-bottomed boats would haul heavy goods up and down the River Severn between Shrewsbury and Bristol. They would be landed at several quays along the riverbank, such as this one, near to the Welsh Bridge. Just over the Welsh Bridge is an area known as Frankwell, where we find this attractive little cruck-frame building. The cruck frame was carved from a single piece of oak, split down the middle to make a matching pair. This was a very simple but effective way of constructing a house, though it did limit the size of the building that could be supported. Further along Frankwell is this property known as The Mount, better known as the birthplace of Charles Darwin. Born in 1809, Darwin, probably the most famous of all Salopians, was a pupil at Shrewsbury Grammar, where he was known as Gas by his friends. Following his 5-year voyage around the Southern Oceans on board HMS Beagle, Darwin began to formulate his theories on evolution. His book, The Origin of Species, published in 1859, was an overnight success, but also aroused much scorn and ridicule from religious quarters. When the town erected a statue to their favourite son in 1894, the vicar of the day claimed it caused the tower of St Mary's Church to be struck by lightning. Quarry Gardens on the banks of the Severn has been a recreational site for Salopians since the 16th century. Every August it plays host to the highly popular Shrewsbury Flower Show, which was founded in 1874. At the heart of the park is the Dingle, a formal flower garden created by the late Percy Thrower, Shrewsbury's world-renowned gardener. Also in the Dingle is this elaborate structure, the Shoemaker's Arbour, which was built in 1679. This is a reminder of the religious procession known as Corpus Christi, in which all the principal members of the town took part. The procession, which evolved into the Shrewsbury Show, was an important occasion for the town's trade guilds, which would each have had a shelter bearing the name of an arbour. This, in fact, is the gateway to the Shoemaker's Arbour. In the 15th century, Humphrey Kynaston, known as Wild Humphrey, recovered his horse in the quarry after being unseated by him. The son of a local baron, Humphrey fell in with a bad crowd and was outlawed for his part in the murder of a Church Stretton man. Kynaston's horse, Beelzebub, was believed to be possessed by an evil spirit. One evening, whilst leaving the town late at night, the town gatekeeper recognised him and snatched at Beelzebub's bridle. The horse bolted, and Kynaston dived into the River Severn. Swimming upstream, he came upon Beelzebub quietly grazing here in the quarry. In 1516, Henry VIII gave Humphrey a free pardon, and his family gave him a small estate near to Welshpool, where he died in 1534. Built in 1883 by a private company, Kingsland Bridge was the culmination of a succession of previously failed attempts. The segmental iron arch that supports a suspended roadway is 65 metres long. Nowadays, users of the privately owned bridge pay their tolls to an automated machine, rather than to a smartly dressed tollkeeper. Following the Norman conquest, Shrewsbury soon developed into a highly fortified town. In 1220, King Henry III decreed that the whole town should be completely protected by an outer wall. Records show that this took 32 years to accomplish. These walls literally experienced highs and lows, but were more or less intact until the 18th century. Sadly, all that is visible today is this 500-yard stretch on the south side of the town. This 13th century tower, once known as Wheeler's Tower, is the only complete tower to have survived. It is now owned and managed by the National Trust. Old St Chad's Chapel is all that remains of a church said to have been founded in the 8th century by King Offa of Mercia. It is reputed to have stood on the site of a palace built by the princes of Powys. The church had a massive central tower, which ultimately proved to be its downfall. In 1788, soon after his arrival in the town, Thomas Telford was asked to advise on repairs to the church. He reported that the tower was in imminent danger of collapse and recommended removing the large church bells. His advice was ignored, and a few days later the tower did in fact collapse, whilst bells were being rung for a funeral. This fine building near to St Chad's was home to Robert Clive whilst he was Mayor of Shrewsbury. For many years it was home to the Clive Museum, but more recently it has been converted back to a private residence. Market Square was established in the mid-13th century on an area of damp wasteland. Prior to this, the market is thought to have been sited close to St Alkmund's Church. The old Market Hall was built in 1595 by Walter Hancock in response to a major upturn in the town's trade. The upper floor was reserved for the sale of wool, whilst the open ground floor was intended for general retail. A carved figure below the old clock is that of Richard, Duke of York, and was salvaged from the old Welsh bridge. The carved angel on the south wall was taken from the castle gate. These tally holes may have been used to keep a record of the sale of fleeces, or possibly tolls paid by stallholders to trade here. This bronze statue was erected to the memory of Robert Clive in 1860, at a cost of 200 guineas. Clive is credited with winning control of India for Britain after his victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. At the rear of the square is the classically fronted Music Hall, which was built in 1839 by Edward Haycock. In the bar and foyer can be seen the remains of a mansion built for Thomas Vaughan in 1335. The roof timbers were replaced after a fire in 1917, but are a faithful copy of the original. Part of the building is now turned over for use as the Tourist Information Office, which makes a fitting place to end our guided tour of Shrewsbury.